Welcome to the Bruton Knowles Landmark podcast. Well, we'll be doing something a little bit different in this episode. It's a two-parter. Rachel Reeves has announced her second autumn budget as Chancellor. Today's episode, part one, we'll be having some quick-fire discussion around the policies, decisions, and what wasn't mentioned outside number 10 Downing Street at the lectern, an instant reaction, if you will. And you can come back here later in the week when we'll have a much more detailed discussion. Joining me are three BK partners: Guy Emmerson, Development and Planning Faculty Head; Nigel Billingsley, Head of Skills and National Utilities and Infrastructure Team North; and Dorian Wraggand, Head of Commercial. We'll be talking about what's next for the nation after the latest set of measures and financial decisions were laid out. So, at a glance, the headlines are as follows. A freeze on national insurance thresholds extended for 3 years from 2028. Legal minimum wage to rise in April by 4.1% for over 21s and 8.5% for 18 to 20-year-olds. 13 billion for funding for 7 regional mayoralties, can't say that. A mansion tax of between 2,500 and 7,500 for properties valued over 2 million. Electric car drivers will be subject to a 3p charge for every mile they drive from April 2028, including plug-in hybrid vehicles, which will be charged 1.5p per mile. We've got extra funding of 48 million to boost capacity in the planning system by recruiting 350 extra planners. And we've got 783 million for new local authority growth programmes over 3 years to support regeneration across Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So those are the quick glance headlines. Obviously, there's a lot more in the budget which we can probably get onto in another episode. But Guy, what's your first take on Rachel Reeves' second budget as Chancellor?
Well, I guess, and slightly dare to say it, but it's bad, but maybe initially not as bad as I had perhaps feared. I think, though, when you look at the cumulative impact of this and the last budget, it is putting a lot of additional tax burden on a lot of people. And, I think there's going to be quite a lot of kickback from it, but at least it gives us an element of certainty and an element of we know what the playing field now is and we can plan and move forward without the uncertainty that existed before.
Do you think some of the reaction around it not being as bad as people thought was down to a lot of the stuff that was leaked over the last month, the sort of pre-budget information, which was kind of all over the place in terms of it was going to be an income tax rise, it wasn't, and we've been drip-fed lots of different scenarios, which ultimately quite a lot of those just haven't transpired.
No, and I just think the kite flying exercise and where it comes from isn't particularly the point, but I just don't think it was helpful, was it? It certainly wasn't helpful for the market when we were talking about stamp duty charges on sellers over a certain threshold, or capital gains tax on primary residences, or, national insurance on rental income. That sounded really, really bad, didn't it? But yeah, at least it's not that sort of thing, but that's not to gloss over the fact that it is, it's still going to have an impact.
Yeah, what do you think, Nigel? What's your overall take from the budget?
I think my initial thoughts on the budget are that when you look at the market reaction, I think she's managed to produce a position where the market has allowed this budget to proceed without causing any sort of catastrophes, which I think is a good thing for the country. I think as a general point, it's a sort of budget that you probably ought to expect from a Labour administration, where there's a redistribution of wealth from people that are earning money to people that are unfortunately less able to earn. And I think that's part of the political view of a Labour Party. I think the other issue that we've got is that in terms of actual tax increases, there seem to be quite a lot of relatively small tax increases that individually don't seem too bad. But I think for a whole section of the population, particularly people that have progressed in their careers or have their own businesses, you'll see that the positivity in the country, I think it's quite difficult for people to be positive when they see more of their earned income being taken away. From a professional perspective, though, one of the positive things is that the infrastructure funding that's been previously announced has been protected. And that gives us some stability in terms of developing new infrastructure across the country, in particular the Lower Thames Crossing, which is, I think, really important to connect UK to mainland Europe via Kent and the Channel crossings. So that's really positive. And also in terms of some of the other infrastructure things that we see, small nuclear, which is important, I think, to help generation and help to balance the load from some of the other non-wind and solar developments. So I think in some senses it's a relatively neutral budget, with some money being siphoned from those who earn money to those that are less able to earn.
It struck me, the budget struck me really in considering the policies and the current state of the government and the finances, that we're in a position where overall, looking at holistically, we've got a government with record levels of spending on welfare and government infrastructure. We've got record levels of borrowing and debt and very little fiscal headroom to move in. And we've got a government that can't make changes it needs to make to reduce both expenditure and debt finance because of a political fragmented system, both within the party and outside. And if we look at Europe, not so far away, you've got a system there that the governments have got record levels of government expenditure. You've got record borrowing levels, and you've got governments who can't influence change because of the number and the fragmented nature of the political system on the continent. And it struck me, listening to the budget, that the net outcome of Brexit has been that we've ended up in the mirroring the European government and fiscal model, which was never the case before Brexit. So I think it's a case of unexpected consequences.
So in terms of the overall budget, I mean, any kind of surprises, or was it mostly expected inclusions? What's the general view?
From my perspective, I'm not so sure that it was a surprise. Perhaps maybe it's more of a relief that some of the other things that we spoke about a minute ago didn't come in. But, the emotive mansion tax or the high value council tax surcharge, that's not as bad as it might have been. At least it's banded. At least it's not a percentage charge over a certain threshold. Obviously, it's going to create a bit of a cliff edge. It'll be difficult to sell a house for £2 million now, won't it? Much like it was difficult in the old days with the stamp duty thresholds.
It's certainly going to encourage some bunching around key values, isn't it?
I think that's right. And what we mustn't forget is that that's subject to annual inflation and 5-yearly revaluations. So what's 1.7 now may well be 2 million in 5 years if things go well. There's going to be some drag to bring more of that into the net. But I suppose the issue is it just the opening of the door for, the beginning of a tax on property wealth, and that there's going to be more to come. And all we're doing is establishing a principle. Yeah,
because with many taxes like this, when they come in first time, it's a start of a 10, isn't it? I mean, in truth, those numbers in 10 years' time will look very, very different, won't they? The difficulty is the icebreaker, isn't it? Is actually introducing it. If we change from, it would be very interesting if we change from Labour to, I don't know, somebody else in the next election. Would they keep it? Because very often, taxes that have been introduced under an old regime do get kept by the new one. It will be interesting to watch that one, I think, because I think it's successive governments will probably work out that it's a relatively easy way of clawing in some extra revenue.
I think we can also just take a minute to think about what wasn't in there. So I didn't feel there was much to stimulate the housing market in particular or encourage development. So, no reforms on stamp duty, no reintroduction of a Help to Buy type scheme, which in some ways is a shame. But on the other hand, at least there was nothing to cause an absolute collapse either. And so, as we were saying earlier, now the suspense is over. Hopefully the market's able to look forward with a bit more certainty. Maybe that pressure valve for movers and buyers that's been building up, well, certainly since the summer, can be released. And it would be great, wouldn't it, to just get the market back operating normally again with an element of certainty once all this kite flying stuff's been put behind us.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is that, and I think to be fair, it was picked up on through the OBR announcement. Obviously, hilariously, the one that came out before the budget, but effectively, we talked about it in the previous podcast around the previous budget. Not really a budget for growth in the wider or general economy, and that's reflected in the forecast. Yes, there's some fiscal headroom being derived from it, but in terms of what makes people's lives easier, a successful growing economy with a lower inflation rate helps absolutely everybody. On the face of it, it doesn't seem to have achieved that, so because there just isn't enough incentives in there for growth. It is generally a tax-raising budget.
I think in terms of surprises, that so many things have been trailed and not delivered. There wasn't much left to surprise anybody. But I think the thing that's probably a surprise is that she didn't take the opportunity to actually acknowledge that we are in a position where, given the amount of spending that we have as a country, we need to do something in terms of tax rises. And what she seems to have done really is to fiddle around the margins and lots of taxes, instead of take the brave decision to say we need to increase one of the big taxes, whether that's VAT or whether that's income tax. And I think by not doing that, it sets us up for a position where all these small taxes, they're available to people to do something that means they'll minimise their tax burden. And maybe she won't get the money that she expects. And then we'll be back in this position again in a year's time or 2 years' time. And I think by acknowledging that actually if we came in and we increased one of the big basic taxes and got the revenue in from that gives us the capital headroom in terms of the UK PLC to progress on, and perhaps gives that amount for growth which we need.
Disappointingly, we didn't see any policies in there that support growth and regeneration, entrepreneurship, innovation. And in our conversations with the defence, tech and cyber sector, which is very high on the government's economic growth plan, all of the sort of manufacturers, the City of London, have all said one of the key components to creating growth in the UK is a support of these sectors to allow businesses to be set up by entrepreneurs, to get funding in the UK and allow them to grow. There's nothing in the budget today that would seem to me to support any of those outcomes. There's nothing in it that would seem to support inward investment, which we desperately need. And so I think to that extent, it doesn't really hit the notes that we had expected from a budget, from a government that's a year in and is trying to promote growth. Other than that, the only other things that we weren't expecting, I think, were the 50% capital gains tax relief on EOTs, selling businesses to employees. And the only other issue was putting a number of 3 pence per mile on the charge for electric cars. Everything else, I think, was widely expected. And so, yeah, overall, I think disappointing from an economic regeneration and growth perspective, but hope that the policies they put in place will allow them the political collateral to create changes to the benefit system.
The cost of burden in the wider economy is significant, and I think small tax breaks or tax incentives they are going to prove, I'm afraid, to do very little, simply because a lot of businesses, I suppose, they're on an edge, really. You look at the high street and you look at the leisure sector, it's not going to take much for us to see quite a lot of businesses closing. I don't think saving £1,500, £2,000 on your rates in the context of all their other difficulties is really going to cut it. But the Chancellor will argue that they're doing their best and they can wave the flag and say that they're doing things to help the high street and the leisure industry. But ultimately, I don't think any of it's significant enough to make a big difference, unfortunately.
Yeah, that whole fiscal drag point is something that slightly gets brushed under the carpet by a government. But, when you think about that and the extra tax that provides, obviously why they're doing it, but it means a lot more people are paying a lot more tax, not just income tax, but inheritance tax and everything else where fiscal drag applies.
It's a wider sense, though, isn't it, as well, Guy, that if people make money and have a reasonable year in terms and get a good bonus, they're going to be taxed if they put that money in a salary sacrifice scheme and support their pension, which is disappointing because I think given the state of the public sector pension, as people move forward, I think pensions are a real issue, that people undersave for pensions. But if you add on to that the fact that if they then put money into an ISA, the ISA amount's been reduced. And of course, people are reluctant to put that into stocks and shares. They might have done quite well this year with the dot-com boom, but it's, over the years, people don't want to risk their hard-earned savings. So you start to apply those to people, and it's just a less rosy scenario for people, I think. And that, I think, impacts people's general view and optimism and positivity. And that has an impact on the economy.
Yeah, the general sentiment and direction of travel, I agree, Nigel. I think it's very much with the intangible intangibles, isn't it, around why does something feel successful and why does it make people want to invest, which is why the OBR figures are slightly concerning, because, the medium to longer term picture for UK economy is of pretty much flatlined, really. There isn't any great growth stimulus in there, which presents a real difficulty for government, because annually they spend more than they did before the previous year, without that growth coming through in the economy. So, yeah, I suspect the next budget will see tax increases, because how do they break that circle, really? And the only answer is to cut expenditure significantly or increase revenue. So that's kind of where we are at the moment. I mean, thinking about BK clients, just very quickly, what takeaways have we got? Any impacts for our clients in terms of that particular budget, thinking of our own sectors?
Related directly to the property world, the business rates, we were expecting an extension of the business rates for the retail sector, and Rachel Reeves confirmed that there'll be a permanently lowered relief now on retail property. That's going to be funded by increased taxation on commercial properties valued at over £500,000. So that's going to sweep up quite a lot of large, especially industrial properties. Interestingly, while she mentioned sheds in her speech, she avoided the mentioning that retail properties will also be swept up in that. We were expecting that retail properties valued at over 500,000 would be exempt from the increased business rates taxation, but she wasn't explicit on that point. It might come out later in due course. But if they aren't exempt, there is a forecast that 400 plus shops across the UK will close because they'll be unprofitable. And of course, that's further impacted by the rise in minimum wage, which will hit the retail and hospitality sector again. So a double-edged sword. I see that being a bit of a problem.
I was going to say, I think from my perspective, that by protecting the infrastructure budget, that's positive. And so I think that the projects that people are working on and are considering at the minute, those should carry on in terms of the budget. There hasn't been any sort of cutting back. It's not like when sort of John Major just axed the road building programme, etc. So that's protected. I think that's positive for our infrastructure clients. The issue potentially comes for some of our claimant clients who aren't going to be particularly as wealthy because of the overall impact. But I think in terms of my area, it's probably a steady state budget, really.
Yeah, and from my perspective, what I've sort of mentioned previously, I'm hoping that the market will be sighing a bit of relief now that it's not as bad as it was. I'm hoping that the transaction rate will start to normalise again, and that's that can only be a good thing. From the sort of planning perspective you mentioned at the beginning, yeah, there is more money for additional planning officers, but I mean, it's spent on graduate schemes. It's spent on encouraging retraining of, I think, what they're calling, mid-career professionals. But I'm not sure what it's doing to attract people into the profession in the first place. And it's hard to sort of see how that's going to make a significant immediate impact. But when you link it to the earlier announcements, last year, I understand the government is saying, well, we've created the headroom for an extra 1,400 planners into the system. Well, that would be good if that could be delivered. And that would solve quite a lot of issues to do with land supply, consents. So yeah, from that perspective, I wish them more, I wish them well with that, because I think it'll be good for the markets and our clients.
That brings us to the end of today's episode, and I hope it's given you food for thought as we all unpack the measures and decisions taken by the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, on Wednesday. We'll be back with a bigger bumper episode on the budget once it's all had time to settle and we can do a deep dive into a few of the policies. A big thank you to our guests, Guy Emmerson, Dorian Wraggand and Nigel Billingsley, for sharing their insights and opinions. If you would like to find out more about the work Bruton Knowles is doing, head over to brutonknowles.co.uk. And of course, don't forget to follow or subscribe on Landmark, your favourite podcast platform, so you never miss an episode. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.